Good evening, visitors. Welcome to the Australian War Memorial's last post ceremony. My name is Michaela Kerrison, and joining us today from the Australian Army is Warrant Officer Class 1 Virginia Morris. Today, we remember the Australian and British prisoners of war who died at the Sandakan prisoner of war camp, or as a result of the Sandakan death marches during the Second World War. The Sandakan death marches remain the greatest war atrocity committed against Australians. In 1942, the Japanese sent prisoners of war from Singapore to build an airstrip at Sandakan in Borneo. Over time, their rations were reduced and physical abuse was increased. In 1945, with Allied forces advancing towards Borneo, the Japanese began marching Australian and British prisoners of war westward to Ranau through the island's rugged interior. The weak and malnourished prisoners staggered along jungle tracks for more than 260 kilometres. Many died en route, their bodies never recovered. Those too weak to continue were killed by the guards. Of the 2,500 prisoners of war originally held at Sandakan, only 6, all Australians, survived the war. We warmly welcome the family of Private Charles Henry McDonald, whose story will be told shortly. We are honoured to acknowledge the members of the United States Congressional Delegation who are in attendance this evening. We welcome the veterans who have served, those that are still serving, and the families that love and support them. The live stream of this ceremony is made possible by the Returned and Services League of Australia and the RSL and Services Clubs Association. We welcome members who are watching the broadcast of this ceremony across Australia. During this evening's ceremony, wreaths will be laid at the base of the Pool of Reflection by family and visitors to the memorial. If you are able, please stand and join in singing the national anthem.
Australians, oh, let us rejoice, for we are one and free. We've golden soil and wealth for toil. Our home is God by sea. Our land abounds in nature's gifts of beauty, rich and rare. In history's page, let every stage advance Australia fair. In joyful strains, then let us sing, advance Australia fair.
The Australian War Memorial was the vision of Charles Bean, Australia's First World War official historian. Bean landed with the Australian troops on Gallipoli and stayed with them at the front through to the end of the war. The idea of this national memorial and museum came to him at Pozières, France, in the depths of the bloody fighting of 1916. Bean's idea was that this would be a place where families and friends could mourn loved ones buried in faraway places. It would also be a place that could help all Australians understand what these men and women had endured and what they had done for us. Bean's vision, to which we remain true, is best expressed as inscribed in the entrance to the memorial's galleries. Here is their spirit, in the heart of the land they loved, and here we guard the record which they themselves made. Tonight, we will read the story behind just one of those on the Roll of Honour, which lists the names of more than 103,000 men and women who have given their lives for us in war and on operations for more than a century. But first, we present a lament, Flowers of the Forest. Wreaths or floral tributes will now be laid at the base of the Pool of Reflection.
Today we remember and pay tribute to Private Charles Henry McDonald. Charles McDonald was born on the 9th of November 1912 in Wellington, New South Wales, the son of Thomas Jackson and Anne Harvey McDonald. Charles had numerous siblings, including half-brothers and sisters from his mother's previous partner. Australia went to war in September 1939 and McDonald duly enlisted in the Australian Imperial Force in Sydney on the 28th of October 1941. The next day, he was sent to the 1st Infantry Training Battalion stationed in Tamworth. By the end of the year, Japan had entered the war, bringing danger close to home. In mid-January 1942, Private McDonald was sent by sea from Sydney to Fremantle, Western Australia. For going absent without leave for 24 hours, he was fined 2 days' pay and detained in barracks for 10 days. Released at the end of January, Charles embarked for overseas service with the 2nd Echelon Reinforcements for the 8th Division, which had been engaged in heavy fighting against the Japanese in Malaya and points further south across the Netherlands, East Indies and Rabaul. Charles arrived in Java and joined a scratch force of Australian troops that had been hurriedly deployed to help Dutch forces defend the island. Black Force, as it was known, comprised some 3,000 Australian troops under the command of Brigadier Arthur Blackburn, VC. At the end of February, Japanese troops began landing on Java and quickly advanced inland. After a few days of fighting southwest of Batavia, today's Jakarta, the Australians were overwhelmed by the much larger enemy force. Dutch forces on Java capitulated on the 8th of March, and a few days later, their situation hopeless, the Australians reluctantly followed suit. Charles was among those transported to Changi and was later one of 1,500 POWs that had made up B Force, which sailed from Singapore on the 8th of July 1942 in one of the so-called hell ships, the Ubi Maru. 10 days later, the group established a camp at Sandakan on the northern eastern coast of North Borneo, where prisoners began building an airstrip. At first, conditions and food supplies were reasonable. However, from September 1942, the Japanese control began to tighten. From mid-1943, conditions at Sandakan deteriorated, due partly to the arrival of brutal Formosan guards. A small carriage was built within the camp to punish prisoners for trivial offences. Some men were confined without being able to stand up and with little food for as long as a month. Treatment of the remaining prisoners worsened in 1944 with brutal beatings, torture and dwindling food supplies. By early 1945, the Japanese feared an Allied invasion of Borneo, and they began moving prisoners away from the coast, overland to Ranui, a small village some 250 kilometres to the west. The first group of 455 prisoners left in batches of 50, beginning on the 28th of January. Already weak from beriberi and malnutrition, and most lacking boots, those who fell by the wayside or were unable to continue were executed along the way. Further Allied advances and increased bombing forced the abandonment and torching of the Sandakan prisoner of war camp. Further marches took place in May and June, while the weak and ill were left behind without accommodation, food or medical care. Some 2,428 British and Australian prisoners of war died at Sandakan or in the death marches to Ranui. 6 Australians survived the death marches. Records indicate that Private Charles McDonald was among those who remained in camp, too sick to join the overland marches. He succumbed to malaria at Sandakan No. 2 camp on the 3rd of June 1945 and was buried in a slit trench within the compound. Like most, his remains were never recovered, and after the war, today he is commemorated on the Luban Memorial, which names over 2,000 Australians who died while prisoners of war in Borneo and the Philippines who have no known grave. He was 32 years old. His name is listed on the Roll of Honour on my left, among almost 40,000 Australians who died while serving in the Second World War. His photograph is displayed today by the Pool of Reflection. This is but one of many stories of service and sacrifice told here at the Australian War Memorial. We now remember Private Charles Henry McDonald, who gave his life for us, for our freedoms, and in the hope of a better world.
Please stand for the reading of the ode and the sounding of the last post.
They shall grow not old as we that are left grow old. Age shall not weary them, nor the years condemn. At the going down of the sun and in the morning, we will remember them. Lest we forget.
Lest we forget. We leave you this evening with the words of the memorial's founder, Charles Bean. Many a man lying out there at Poziere or in the low scrub at Gallipoli with his poor, tired senses barely working through the fever of his brain, has thought in his last moments, well, it's over. But in Australia, they will be proud of this. Ladies and gentlemen, that concludes the last post ceremony. On behalf of the Director, staff and volunteers, thank you for visiting the Australian War Memorial today and for your continued support during the Memorial's development project. We wish you all a very pleasant evening.